Does anybody know what that sound is? Okay, can we go back to the first slide, please? Yeah, it's Sputnik. It was supposed to be a little bit of a mystery, but yeah, that was the sound of Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. It was launched by the Soviet Union on October 4th, 1957. It was the height of the Cold War. The Americans and the Soviets were competing on many fronts, including the race to get into space. The Americans were shocked and surprised that the Soviets had beaten them there. This is the Applied Physics Lab in Laurel, Maryland. It was founded during World War II to rapidly get technology to the battlefield. After the war, its mission shifted towards space. After the war, its mission shifted towards space. The lab was full of scientists and engineers from virtually every discipline, brought together to solve the toughest technical problems. While today the lab is in the middle of the Baltimore-Washington suburbs, at the time, the area was very rural, so the employees tended to stay and eat in the on-site cafeteria for lunch. Of course, they would talk about their work, but they'd also talk about the issues of the day. And on that day, all anyone could talk about was Sputnik. Two physicists were talking together over lunch and wondered if they could pick up the signal from Sputnik. The Soviets had put a simple microwave emitter on board in order to prove to the world they were the first ones into space. One of the scientists was in the middle of his PhD studies on microwaves and had a receiver sitting on his desk. Word quickly spread, and soon a crowd had formed in his office, listening for that elusive signal. Within hours, they were locked in, and they were among the first people ever to hear a man-made signal from space. They hooked the receiver up to an audio amplifier and started recording the sound of each pass. That was the sound that was playing at the beginning. And of course, being scientists, they logged the time of each recording as well. Now, you've heard of the Doppler effect, right? The pitch of a sound coming toward you is higher than the pitch of the same sound as it moves away. Sputnik emitted a constant pitch, but as the satellite rose over the horizon, moved overhead, and set over the opposite horizon, the scientists observed a Doppler effect. Knowing this, they were able to calculate the velocity of each pass of Sputnik, as well as the point in time when it was closest to straight overhead. With the help of some mathematicians in the lab, they were soon able to plot the entire orbit of Sputnik. They had moved from curiously listening in to actively measuring. They were curious beyond the obvious. Over the next few weeks, a network of scientists formed, each bringing their own unique skills to refining the measurements. It was a lot like a trailblazer project. But the real breakthrough happened when one of the directors at the lab asked the question, if we can calculate an unknown location in space from a known location on the ground, the lab, can we reverse that and figure out an unknown location on the ground using known locations in space? In other words, if we had a constellation of satellites orbiting the Earth, each emitting a signal, could we listen in on that signal from a point on the Earth and calculate our position? Think about that for a moment. He basically had come up with the concept of GPS before the US had even launched its first satellite. 30 years after that first provocative question, and the GPS constellation was operational. 20 years after that, and GPS had become an essential part of our everyday lives. So how were they able to come up with such a profound breakthrough? Because of three conditions. First, the lab was founded to bring together a broad cross-section of people to solve the toughest problems. They had enough people of the right skills. Second, it was a place where what we call liquid networks could form, in labs and cafeterias, connecting those people so they could solve those problems. And finally, it was a place where you could take a risky bet on something like GPS before the US had even launched its first satellite. So although the lab was founded to solve urgent problems, they could think long term. So the rest of today is about innovation. I'm going to talk to you for about 45 minutes, and then the real fun of the Trailblazer Finals will happen. But first, you do have to listen to me. However, I promise this won't be about charts and graphs and bullet points. In fact, this is the only slide that follows the official template. What I want to do is talk to you, the leaders of this great company, about how we can tap into what we are, which is a company of experts, to transform Allegion into the innovation leader of our industry. That can only happen if each and every one of us creates the environment and conditions for innovation to happen. And I want today to be a call to action for all of us to make that possible. It's a tough challenge. We lead a complex business with competing priorities. We have over 9,000 employees, but they're spread out all over the world. So how can I prove to you that despite those challenges, we have what it takes to be the innovation leaders?
In the face of overwhelming odds, I'm left with only one option. I'm gonna have to science the shit out of this.
So what do you say? Why don't we science the shit out of this? And the first thing I want to do is prove to you scientifically that size matters. For a long time, scientists have observed that as life gets bigger, it slows down. Elephants have slower heart rates than humans, who have slower heart rates than mice. At the University of California at Davis's Agricultural School, a scientist named Max Kleber made an interesting discovery as he was studying the effect that cattle's body size had on their metabolic rate, which of course determined how much feed they needed. He noticed an interesting correlation, so he expanded his study to animals of all sizes, from shrews to dogs, humans to elephants. But he didn't find a simple linear relationship. A dog might be 40 times heavier than a rat, but its heart rate and metabolism weren't 40 times slower. Instead, he found all the animals he measured followed a mathematical relationship in which the metabolic rate of the creature was equal to its mass to the 3/4 power. There's going to be a quiz on this later. That means that larger species need less energy per pound of body weight than smaller ones. Other scientists found many other biological characteristics that followed this exact same scaling relationship. It seems that animals' infrastructure gets more efficient as they get larger. Their bodies need proportionately less blood vessels, nerves, organs, etc. to run, and thus they need less energy per pound. So then a physicist, Geoffrey West, was curious to see if human systems, specifically cities, followed the same scaling relationships as animals. So he gathered and plotted all sorts of data against city size. Numbers of gas stations, miles of paved roads, numbers of patents filed, even things like crime and artistic output. Would a small town like this one produce and consume at the same rate per resident as a big city like this one? He saw the city as a sprawling organism defined by its infrastructure. This implies that the real purpose of a city, and the reason cities keep growing, is their ability to exploit massive economies of scale, just like big animals do. Now, if a city followed a simple linear scaling relationship, you'd see a graph like this. As population doubles, output doubles, but so does consumption. Twice as many patents, but twice as many roads. Instead, he found that cities do indeed get more efficient in terms of their infrastructure. Gas stations, roads, energy consumption on a per capita basis were all reduced as the city got larger. And the opposite happened when he looked at output. A city 10 times the size of another city doesn't just produce 10 times as much innovation, it's 17 times as innovative. A metropolis 50 times larger than a town is 130 times as productive. Patents, GDP, numbers of crazy people, all increased at a faster than expected rate. So why is this important? Well, it shows empirically that cities do indeed get the same scaling benefits that animals do. Well, corporations are human systems and behave a lot like cities. We get more output per employee and do so with less infrastructure as we scale up. Now, that doesn't mean we just go hire a bunch of extra people and expect output to rise. It does mean that if we can bring our people together in ways where they can collaborate, we get the benefits of increased size and scale. And as leaders, given that our teams are spread out all over the world, we have to find ways to virtually bring our people together to get those economies of scale. So I've showed you that human systems get more efficient as they grow. But why is it important that Allegion not only get the benefit of having 9,000 employees, but that we involve each and every one of them in creating innovation? Let's look at that. You know what this is, right? It's a normal distribution, sometimes called a bell curve. It's the foundation of Six Sigma. Many human characteristics follow a normal distribution. For example, height. But many, many things in this world don't follow a normal distribution. In fact, most things don't. This distribution is called a power law distribution. Unlike a bell curve that has a single peak representing the most common value, and where you're just as likely to see lower values as higher ones, a power law distribution has a single peak and an infinitely long tail. So let's look at a real-life example. This shows all of the books that might have sold in a given year. On the left, the highest peaks represent the bestsellers. On the far right are all the obscure titles that only sold a few copies, maybe only one. Now, if you're Barnes & Noble or Borders, you remember them, you have a big investment in physical stores and only a limited amount of shelf space. You can only stock a certain number of titles. So what do? You focus on the left half of the distribution. You only stock those titles that are highly likely to sell. But then along came Jeff Bezos, who figured out how to take advantage of all the volume on the right half of the distribution. He created Amazon.com, which doesn't have physical stores and will sell any title to anyone. Amazon figured out how to exploit that there's more aggregate volume among the low sellers than there is among the best sellers. In fact, in the early days, Amazon was perfectly happy for you to still go to Barnes & Noble to buy the bestseller, knowing you'd come to them for everything else. Bezos created what is now one of the most powerful retailers in the world by exploiting the power law distribution. And the internet's created many similar opportunities. For example, the way we buy and consume music. And there's some important human characteristics that ought to follow a power law distribution. So Samir, can you bring out the results of our data collection exercise? Thank you, Samir. So you remember last year I wore a costume. I outsourced it or delegated it this year. So let's take a look at the results. Okay, it's as I was expecting. So we'll put them up on the screen. So this shows the years of experience in the security industry of the people in this room. The data we collected at lunch on the posters, plotted on a frequency plot. Now, one thing we can conclude from this is we have a lot of really experienced people in this room. So if you're one of the people with 30 or more years of experience, please stand up. So let's give them a hand. We also have a few people with only 1 year of experience. So stand up if you put a dot next to the one. So let's welcome them to Allegion. Now let's say Allegion is facing a tough problem. You know what we've done in the past when facing a challenge. We form a tiger team. We take our most experienced people and send them off to find a solution. That's why we have experts, right? But let's say we took the top 10% of leaders in this room and set them off to solve a problem. We'd be tapping into 478 years of total experience. Failing to take advantage that in this room, there is 1,750 years of total industry experience available to us. Not to mention 10 times as many people who might have some critical insight despite not yet being an expert in the security industry. That is the foundation of crowdsourcing, which has been used to solve some difficult technical and scientific problems. So let's look at a real example of a problem that was solved by tapping into the knowledge of the masses rather than relying on experts. HIV researchers wanted to figure out the molecular structure of a virus protein they observed in monkeys. Knowing the details of that structure would allow them to design drugs that could attack and kill the virus. Now, when scientists want to know the atomic structure of a molecule, they use a technique called X-ray crystallography. X-rays are beamed through a sample into a detector, resulting in a 2D image of how the X-rays are deflected by the electrons orbiting the atoms in the molecule. But then comes the painstaking work of coming up with a molecular design that matches the observed results. For over 10 years, those researchers struggled to come up with a molecule that matched their X-ray image. So they turned to a game called Fold-It. Developed by researchers at the University of Washington, Fold-It turns scientific problems into competitive games. Players use spatial reasoning and critical thinking skills to build 3D models of molecules, trying to minimize the internal energy of their designs, just like happens in the physical world. The HIV researchers used the game to entice players to design molecules that would match their X-ray. Very few of the players had any background in biochemistry. 600 players on 41 teams came up with over 1.25 million candidate molecules. And in just 3 weeks, they came up with a virus protein design that had stumped the researchers for over a decade. And the final breakthrough came from Fold-It user Mimi, a science technician at a high school near Manchester, UK. Her final breakthrough was a way to make the protein more globular in a way that matched the results perfectly. So a problem that had stumped the best experts in the field for over 10 years was solved in 3 weeks by a science technician at a high school. Now, the researchers could not have known that Mimi would solve their problem. Otherwise, they would have just hired her. Instead, by opening up the problem to the masses, they increased the likelihood that a Mimi out there would find their solution. So let me tie together two of the things I've been talking about. We've established that human organizations get more efficient as they grow. But something odd happens to corporations. Corporations get accelerating output, like cities, as they exploit economies of scale. But something eventually happens to corporations to make them stop accelerating. They continue to grow, but less effectively. They stop acting like cities and return to the norm. Jeffrey West consistently observed this S-curve behavior in his studies of over 35,000 companies. Now, you recall that many things about cities grow at a faster than expected rate. GDP, patents, I even said crazy people. That was only half in jest. Cities are magnets for people outside the norm, the outliers, the people on the tails of the distribution. One thought to explain why corporations don't continue to scale like cities is that we overvalue the norm. We tend to truncate the people on the tails or fail to exploit their talents. So as leaders, how do we ensure that we're getting the best out of our people? How do we ensure we're getting the contributions of each and every one of our people, regardless of position or background? There are lots of ways to do this. I don't have all the answers, but you'll see later, the Trailblazer competition is a great way to leverage talent from around the world. This year's competition is remarkable for the breadth and diversity of the participants, and Samir will tell you more about that later. So I've scientifically proven to you that Allegion has the size we need. We're a company of experts, over 9,000 of them. So we've got the size we need if we can tap into the expertise of each and every one of our people. But once we've tapped into that expertise, how do we ensure we're getting the best out of our people? How do we prevent them from working in isolation on only the problems that affect their location, their function, or their business unit. We do it by encouraging liquid networks. Liquid networks arise spontaneously rather than through formal connections. Your LinkedIn network is a formal network. An org chart represents a formal network. Liquid networks come about when people cross paths on an ad hoc basis and spontaneously connect. But speaking of liquids, I want to talk for a minute about one particular liquid that's been the driving force of much of the innovation and prosperity that created the modern world. I'm talking about coffee, that wonderful source of inspiration and stimulation, vital to the functioning of this leadership meeting. Coffee actually hasn't been around that long. In the 17th century, water, especially in cities, was a source of disease. People in London, for example, drank watered-down beer throughout the day because beer was brewed with boiled water, and additionally, the alcohol helped to kill germs. They even drank something called small beer for breakfast. Of course, that meant people spent most of their time in an alcoholic fog. But people in Arabia had discovered a bean that, when chewed or brewed, gave intoxicating effects of an entirely different sort. And word of coffee quickly spread to Europe. London's first coffee house was opened in 1652 by a Greek named Pasqua Rosé, who had acquired a taste for the brew while trading in the Middle East. Like many innovations, Rosé's coffee house was a threat to established businesses. And he was run out of town by tavern owners because his success was cutting into their business of selling beer. But the innovation could not be stopped. And by 1663, there were 83 coffee houses in London. And by the end of the century, there were hundreds. Now at Allegion, the coffee is free. So aren't we already taking advantage of this source of innovation? No. Because the real innovation engine of the coffee house was not the caffeine buzz, but was the fostering of liquid networks. In 17th century London, when you wanted to hear business news, trade a stock, get political gossip, or even discuss the latest scientific breakthrough, you only had to visit a coffee house. And like today's websites, blogs, and chat rooms, the coffee house you frequented depended on your interests. Those near the Royal Exchange were frequented by businessmen. Those near St. James and Westminster by politicians. And those near St. Paul's Cathedral by theologians and clergymen. Other coffee houses were hotbeds of financial innovation and experimentation. One famous example is the coffee house opened in the late 1680s by Edward Lloyd. It became a meeting place for ship captains, owners, and merchants looking to hear the latest maritime news. It became a natural meeting place for the ship owners and the underwriters who insured their ships. Some of the underwriters started renting booths at Lloyd's. And in 1771, a group of 79 of them collectively founded the Society of Lloyd's, better known today as Lloyd's of London. And the greatest scientific breakthrough of all time happened because of connections made in a coffee house. Members of the Royal Society, England's official scientific body, would often meet at Garraway's Coffee House nearby. And in 1684, Christopher Wren, best known as the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, Robert Hooke, the first scientist to use the microscope to study biology, and Edmund Halley, best known as the discoverer of Halley's Comet, were talking together in Garraway's, discussing whether current thinking about gravity could explain the kind of orbits that Halley was observing in his comets. Now think about that liquid network for a minute. It's as if you went into Starbucks and saw Steve Jobs, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Jane Goodall talking together about what processor to use in the next iWatch. Well, another scientist, Isaac Newton, joined the group in Garraway's. And as a result of the connections he made there, he ended up publishing his Principia Mathematica, which established his principles of universal gravitation, invented calculus, and cemented him as the greatest scientist of all time. So contrary to the popular story, it wasn't an apple falling from a tree that inspired Newton, but a cup of coffee, or rather the connections he made in a coffee house the liquid networks, the spontaneous networks that arose there. And that environment had profound effects on society. This graph shows the per capita GDP of England from the 1260s to the 1860s. Other than a slight increase in output in the 1300s, people basically produced the same amount for hundreds of years until the mid-1600s and the introduction of coffee, or rather the innovations inspired by the coffee house, allowed output to rise, culminating in the Industrial Revolution. Now, we want Allegion's per capita output to rise like that too. So how do we make that happen? How do we create the conditions for liquid networks to form? We don't have the ability to turn our offices into 17th century coffee houses or even into Starbucks. Our people are spread out all over the world, and the reality is the cubicle is here to stay. But if our people are spending all of their time in their cubicles, they're not forming liquid networks, and they're certainly not being creative.
Corporate accounts payable, Nina speaking. Just a moment. Corporate accounts payable, Nina speaking. Just a moment. Corporate accounts payable, Nina speaking. Just a moment. Corporate accounts payable, Nina speaking.
Hello, Peter. What's happening? We have sort of a problem here.
So that's not an environment for being curious beyond the obvious, is it? Now, if you were in that environment, you'd want to break out, wouldn't you?
This gangster here was a smart one. Started living for the Lord and I last. Now all I got to say to you, one of you's gonna be crumb snatching, cheating pranksters. When the Grim Reaper steps up, what the hell you gonna do? Damn, it feels good to be a gangster.
So our job as leaders is to make sure our people are connecting across their work group and across the company, because you never know where those connections are going to lead. Just like here in Faenza, where they've created their own version of the 17th century coffee house. So I've shown to you, using science, that it's up to us as leaders to create the conditions for liquid networks to happen. And there's one final element to meaningful innovation. There you go. The ability to think long term. Television has been around for over 60 years, but for decades, the pace of change was slow. Color television was introduced in the late 1960s, and that was the only real improvement for the first 40 years. You remember the big old cathode ray tube TV sets, right? And as far as remote control went, well, when I was a kid, I was the remote control. But then in the mid-1980s, a group of media and technology executives had the vision to update the resolution of TV for the first time. High definition, or HD TV, was introduced as a standard. 10 years later, around 1996, the first high-definition signal was broadcast. 10 years after that, in 2006, HD TVs became the majority of sets sold. And in 2009, the old standard definition signal was shut down, rendering the previous technology obsolete. This illustrates the 10-10 rule. After an initial innovation occurs, it typically takes 10 years to build out the platform, and then another 10 years for the innovation to overtake the preceding technology. Years ago, I worked in the video surveillance part of the security industry. The entire industry, my company included, was expecting an imminent hockey stick transformation as customers moved from the traditional analog video over coaxial cable to digital or IP video over Ethernet. But it seemed like every year, that transformation was one more year away. In reality, we were living in the middle of the 10-10 rule. IP video first came out in the 1990s. A full platform of offerings was available in the 2000s. And now when you go to ISC West or ASIS or Essen, you only see digital video. It's completely replaced analog. The same thing has happened in electronic locking. 10 years ago, we introduced the first residential electronic lock in the United States. With last year's release of Schlage Sense and this year's additions to the lineup, we now have a complete platform of electronic locking products, and adoption is starting to rise. So 10 years after the initial innovation, and we have a platform. We've lived the first half of the 10-10 rule. If the second half holds, over the next 10 years, we're going to see electronic locking reach its full potential, perhaps even overtaking mechanical. Fortunately, 10 years ago, we had the vision to do the initial innovation. And over the past 10 years, to make the substantial investments to build out the platform, which puts us in a position with reasonable continued investment to exploit the coming hockey stick increase in adoption. So I want to bring it all the way back around to where we started, with Sputnik, and how it inspired the creation of GPS. GPS became fully operational in the late 1980s. The picture you see here is the first portable GPS receiver. It was called a Manpack. In the late 90s, when I was in the Air Force, I worked in the GPS program office. In 1998, this was the state-of-the-art portable GPS receiver. I'd throw it out into the crowd, but it might hurt somebody. It's pretty heavy. Now, it only gave you coordinates, so you use this bit of technology as your graphical user interface. But arguably, thank you, Dr. Tamer. Arguably, at that point, we had a full platform. We had portable receivers, and we had receivers for aircraft, ships, and vehicles. 10 years after that, by around 2008, GPS had shrunk down to the microchip level and only cost a few dollars. GPS had become the universal way that you find your location and you navigate. Another example of the 10-10 rule in action. So while Allegion needs a balanced portfolio of short and long-term investments, it's clear that to be the innovation leaders we aspire to be, we have to be able to think long-term. So I told you I wanted this to be a call to action. We have a company of experts, over 9,000 of them. So we have the size we need if we can tap into the expertise of each and every one of our people. Just like Mimi in the UK was able to solve that problem that stumped the best experts in the field for over 10 years, maybe we've got a problem in China, and the solution is in the head of one of our people in Italy. And maybe our toughest challenge as leaders is creating the environment for those liquid networks to form. So that person in China having the problem can connect with the person in Italy with the solution. And finally, we've clearly got to be able to think long term. Being innovation leaders is going to put us out on the leading edge, which means we have to have the discipline to build out the platforms. And then, of course, to exploit the coming increases in adoption. That takes vision and long-term thinking and a lot of managerial courage. There were a couple themes I picked out during the day and last night that I think at this point I'll try to tie in here. You know, liquid networks is exactly what we were observing happen last night with the orchestra. They had known each other for less than an hour, and they started making connections. And the job of that conductor was to instantly connect the first violins to the second violins, to make sure the rhythm section was connected to the, whatever you call the non-rhythm part of the orchestra. You know, Dave talked about convergence this morning. I think it plays into all of this stuff. We've got the size, we've got the expertise to drive that convergence, but convergence is going to require liquid networks to form among our people, between our mechanical teams, our electronic teams, between Europe, between the Americas, and Asia Pacific. And of course, to exploit that convergence, we're going to have to live in the middle of the 10-10 rule each time we do it, which means disciplined investing and the patience to think long term. And then finally, you know, Marcus Buckingham, I wrote down word for word, he said dynamic, agile, cross-functional teams. And I thought, you know, that kind of perfectly describes a liquid network. We have to make that happen. So anyway, I told you today I was going to use science to prove to you that we have to create these three conditions in order to be innovation leaders. But in reality, it comes down to every person in this room, each and every one of us, creating the environment and the conditions for innovation to happen. And we all have to make that commitment. So thank you for your commitment, and thank you for bringing along our 9,000 experts around Allegiant.